Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Bovine respiratory disease, BRD, is one of the most costly cattle health challenges, leading to death loss, treatment expenses, and reduced performance. The BRD Vaccination Cost-Benefit Calculator helps producers put real numbers to those costs by comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated calves. Simply enter your own operations details to see the potential value of BRD vaccination and whether paying a premium for vaccinated calves makes sense. A link to this calculator can be found in the show notes. This episode features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the October 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and it's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. Today, we're talking about beef beyond borders. Canada's beef industry is built on exports. In 2024, Canada exported 500,000 metric tons of cattle and beef. That's net exports after accounting for the cattle and beef we imported into Canada. Most of Canada's exports, so 75% of volume and close to 80% of the value of those exports went to the US. That's because it's right next door, and our beef products are similar, and American and Canadian consumers have pretty similar preferences and expectations regarding quality. Japan was our second largest export market. Japan primarily buys brisket, flank, plate, chuck, and rib primals from Canada. Now, the rib primal is home to the ribeye steak, which is one of the most highly marbled and high quality and high value cuts. But highly marbled and high quality are subjective terms. Anyone who's seen or tasted Japanese Wagyu beef knows that it has a lot more marbling than Canadian beef. Now, the difference in marbling between Canadian and Japanese beef is partly due to genetics. The Japanese black breed that's raised for Wagyu beef in Japan, those cattle deposit more marbling than the beef breeds that we typically raise in Canada. The difference between Japanese and Canadian marbling is also partly due to management. Those Japanese black cattle are fed differently and for much longer than Canadian beef cattle. But the marbling difference between Japanese and Canadian beef is also partly due to differences in the grading system. In Canada, our grading system evaluates marbling in the ribeye muscle between the 12th and 13th ribs. So that's roughly midway between the front and hind legs of the animal. And a single, double, AAA, or Canada Prime grade gets assigned as the level of marbling increases there in the ribeye between the 12th and 13th rib. And Japan's grading system is different. It evaluates marbling in the muscles between the 6th and 7th ribs. So that's right behind the shoulder. And then they assign one of 12 grades starting at JMGA1 and going all the way up to JMGA12. And the ribeye muscle is shaped sort of like a cone laying on its side. So it becomes smaller as you move forward from the Canadian grading site to the Japanese grading site. And the seams of marbling or intramuscular fat, they run lengthwise through the middle of that muscle. And so that means that because it's getting shaped more like a cone, that those marbling specks are going to be more concentrated and more visible at the Japanese site than they are at the Canadian site. And so that means the ribeye muscle from the same carcass will almost always have a higher marbling score at the Japanese grading site than it does at the Canadian grading site, regardless of genetics or how it's been fed. So being able to translate the Canadian marbling score to a Japanese marbling score, so indicating what our grade would equate to in Japan, may help to market Canadian beef more effectively in Japan. So Oscar Lopez Campos and a team of researchers at Agriculture Canada in Lacombe studied whether the marbling score at Canada's grade site can predict the marbling score at the Japanese grading site. And the research paper is linked in the online article if you want to read that. So how did they do this? Well, they raised 634 Angus calves and slaughtered them either at 11 to 13 months of age as calves or as at 15 to 17-month-old yearlings, slaughtered them at Ag Canada Lacombe. And those carcasses were part of a much bigger study that we'll talk about another time. But of those 634, they took the 394 that had the most marbling, so 92.5% of them were AAA or prime. And they used those carcasses to compare the various meat quality parameters like muscle pH and lean color and intramuscular or marbling fat percentage and visual marbling scores at both the Canadian grading site compared to the Japanese grading site closer to the front. And what did they learn? Well, they learned that on average, the ribeye muscle contained 33% more marbling fat at the Japanese site than at the Canadian grading site. The Japanese grading site also had a higher pH and a brighter red lean color. And those factors can make flecks of marbling appear more obvious to the grader's eyeball. And together, when you put in more intramuscular fat plus redder beef together, that made for higher marbling scores at the Japanese site than at the Canadian grading site. Now, nearly 90% of the carcasses that graded AAA at the Canadian grade site, so between the 12th and 13th ribs, would have graded JMGA 3 or 4 at the Japanese site between the 6th and 7th ribs. And over 85% of the carcasses that graded Canada Prime would have graded as JMGA 4 or 5. But it's noteworthy that 22% of the carcasses in this study, so nearly a quarter of them, achieved a Japanese grade between JMGA 6 and 10 at the Japanese grading site. So that's getting close to the top of the Japanese 12 category system. Now, my guess is that those Canadian carcasses probably also have a lot better muscling than the more dairy-like conformation of the traditional Japanese black cattle. So what does this all mean to you? Well, Japan's a relatively small market for Canadian beef, but it's an important and lucrative market, especially because it helps to diversify our markets beyond here in Canada and next door in the States. Now, Canada only produces 2% of the world's beef. So we're a small player in a large international marketplace. So we need to be able to identify the markets that are looking for what we produce and help give those markets a reason to buy what we produce. The bottom line is that the highest end Wagyu beef is unaffordable to most Japanese consumers, but Canadian cattle can produce beef that is acceptable for the mainstream Japanese consumer. And being able to demonstrate how Canadian quality grades equate to Japanese marbling scores may help give our beef a slight edge in a very important export market. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.